For the impatient, here's your too long didn't watch summary. The A7R II shows very slightly less detail than the 5DSR, but very slightly more detail than the D810. It has about the same high ISO noise as the D810, but very slightly less than the 5DSR. It also has very slightly less dynamic range than the D810, but very slightly more than the 5DSR. In sunlight, autofocusing matches a DSLR. In dim light, autofocusing often fails. Adapted Canon lenses work better than ever, but not as well as a native Canon camera, and an adapter will cost you an extra $400. It offers two modes for 4K video, full frame and a cropped Super 35 mode with better image quality. It's about 3 stops cleaner than a GH4 in low light, it's 1 stop worse than an A7S and a Shogun, but a speed booster with full frame Canon lenses could fix that, and the A7R II doesn't require an external recorder. Recovered shadows in S-Log2 with Super 35 looked even better than the A7S. It can overheat when recording video, but we only made it fail in Super 35 mode with S-Log2 and the LCD screen closed. After recording for more than 20 minutes, it didn't fail in normal room temperature with the screen tilted open. It beats DSLRs in many ways. The electronic viewfinder previews your exposure, shows a histogram before the shot, and can literally see in the dark. Steady shot inside stabilizes any lens, including fast primes. It has 4K video and Wi-Fi, which competing high-resolution DSLRs lack. The silent shutter and small size make it a more discreet camera. More reliable low-light autofocusing and native lens selection make DSLRs better choices for wildlife, indoor sports, and low-light events. The A7R II's short battery life requires you to carry extra batteries when you're traveling or working longer events. DSLRs at this price point also have redundant memory cards providing instant backup of critical shots and USB 3 connections for faster tethering of high megapixel RAW files in the studio. Keep watching for detailed results and subscribe to see us take the A7R II to Peru. 3 days ago, we published the first part of our A7R II test, and we had a lot of requests for further tests. So today we're going to be testing the S-Log versus that in the A7S to see how it does for video. We're going to be trying out the autofocusing in both low light and with moving subjects with native lenses. We're going to check for that overheating problem that happens with 4K recording, and we're going to try out night photography to see if there's extra noise in the long exposures. But first, we're going to retest our image quality tests because a few people pointed out focusing problems between the different cameras and that our camera might have been using 12-bit RAW instead of 14-bit RAW. So we fixed those problems and we're retesting it with the 5DSR, the D810, and the A7R II. With images scaled to the same resolution, more megapixels visibly equaled more detail. The 50 megapixel 5DSR showed slightly more detail than the 42 megapixel A7R II, which in turn showed slightly more detail than the 36 megapixel D810. The winners flipped for dynamic range, with recovered shadows looking best on the D810, second best on the A7R II, and worst on the 5DSR. Because subscribers asked, we repeated the tests in Capture One and found the same results. When comparing ISO 100 on all cameras, the A7R II highlight recovery was about equal to the 5DSR. Both could recover about 2/3 of a stop more highlights than the D810, but that's because ISO 100 on the A7R II is more like ISO 50. The D810's base ISO of 64 is also about a true ISO 50, and when you compare ISO 64 on the D810 to ISO 100 on the A7R II, we see almost exactly the same brightness and highlight recovery. Long story short, everybody cheats the ISO ratings a little bit, but what we said earlier holds true. The D810 still has slightly less total image noise than the other cameras. At higher ISOs and scaled to the same resolution, the A7R II showed exactly the same amount of noise as the D810. Both cameras were a bit cleaner than the Canon. Some early A7R II users complained about strange noise with 30-second exposures, so we tested this and couldn't find any problems. Images appeared identical to the D810 with nothing unusual about them. Now let's see how the S-Log in the A7R II compares to that of the A7S. This lets us get a whole lot of dynamic range out of video. In this test scene, we exposed for the highlights on the third book. After recovering the shadows, the A7R II's Super 35 mode looked better than even the mighty A7S and Shogun. We love the ability to record S-Log2 at ISO 800 or higher. The A7S has a minimum ISO of ISO 3200 when using S-Log2, which requires a neutral density filter in bright sunlight with reasonable apertures. Forgive the misfocus on the second example, it doesn't impact the exposure or noise. It can overheat when recording video. Indoors at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, it failed after 20 minutes in Super 35 mode with S-Log2 and the LCD screen closed. Outside in full sun in 80-degree weather, it failed after 35 minutes with the LCD screen tilted open. We never made it overheat indoors with the screen open, nor outdoors in the shade with a breeze. Now let's test the low light autofocusing with native Sony lenses. To give you an idea of how dark it is here, we're filming at ISO 32,000 at f/0.95. So this is the amount of light you'd get in a very dark club. In my experience with these two cameras here, I also have a D7200 with an f/5.6 zoom lens. So the zoom lenses are pretty close to equivalent. With the focus assist light, the Sony focuses pretty reliably, but the focus assist light would not help you if you were far away from a subject, like you might be at a concert. And without the focus assist light, it pretty reliably misses focus. Sometimes it gets it, sometimes it misses it, but the D7200 does get autofocus just about every time in this level of light. And this is a much less expensive camera. So what we see is the inexpensive DSLRs outperform the more expensive A7R II. However, there's a catch, because while the A7R II isn't autofocusing very well, the viewfinder is extremely bright. In fact, even with an f/5.6 lens, it's like seeing in the dark. So you could do things like manually focus much more easily than you could with a DSLR. And navigating, seeing the picture that you're taking, almost impossible with this. While the camera can focus without a focus assist light, I can hardly see through the viewfinder. The viewfinder here is perfectly bright, making photography overall easier, except for the autofocusing part. This is the Sony on the left, and that's the D7200 on the right. You can see even less of the viewfinder here. Now let's see how this thing tracks focus with stills and video. Tracking autofocus with video worked really well with the native Sony a7R II f4, the best we've tested. A touchscreen would make it more useful. Tracking autofocus didn't work at all with the Canon a7R II f2.8 and the Metabones V4 adapter. Tracking autofocus for stills in good light stunned us. The A7R II with the Sony a7R II f4 got 90% in focus in full sunlight and in overcast conditions, roughly tying the Canon 5DSR and a7R II f2.8. Outdoor sports and weddings should be no problem for the A7R II, and that's a first for a mirrorless camera. However, continuous focusing completely failed to keep up in our indoor sports test, simulating the light of a gym. In low light, the Canon got about 75% in focus, while the Sony completely failed to track Justin. So I'll quickly summarize the A7R II and then answer some questions that arose during the first part of this review. The A7R II is a fantastic camera. I absolutely love it, and as far as an all-in-one camera, it really can't be beat now. We're heading to Peru soon. I need to record 4K video, and I want stills, and in the past, that would have meant carrying a DSLR, and then probably carrying a GH4, and now I can do all that with one camera, so I'm thrilled. To answer some of the questions, the first question I had, why was one of your pictures in the first part of the review out of focus? So to really answer this, I need to go into the methodology a little bit. Now, most organizations like DP Review and DxOMark will use different optics, different lenses on each of the different bodies. And we felt it was imperative to use a single lens, a single copy of a lens on each of the different bodies, because otherwise variations in the optics will make more of a difference than the sensors themselves. So we used a single lens, an 85mm Rokinon prime lens, and it was a Nikon mount because we needed to use a Nikon lens because only Nikon lenses can be adapted to both Sony and Canon. We also needed a lens that had a manual aperture on it because you cannot control the aperture automatically from the Sony and Canon lens, at least not precisely enough. So this lens fit our particular needs. Now, this meant that we had to manually focus on all of these different bodies. And that requires an amazing amount of precision. So my methodology was to use live view and zoom into 1:1 and then manually focus it as close as I could. I would then take a shot and refocus, take another shot, and I repeated that, doing refocusing and taking 3 different shots, and then for each set, at each different ISO, I chose the sharpest of those. Now, despite that methodology, despite using a heavy tripod, a delayed shutter, electronic front curtain shutter, having nobody walking on the same floor as me because that would shake the tripod as well, despite all that, there was still a little bit of difference in the focusing between the Nikon and the Sony bodies. And the point I want to make is that it's really, really hard to isolate the differences between 36 megapixels and 42 megapixels. It's just not that big of a deal. If you're hand-holding the camera and taking a shot outside of a faraway subject, your handshake or the subject's motion blur or the optical qualities of the atmosphere, humidity, are going to completely eliminate any of these differences. Now, you can rest assured with these high megapixels cameras that you'll be getting as much detail as you possibly can given your technique and the optics that you're using, but it's just not that simple to show the differences between them. I used extremely careful technique, and even in those conditions, you can see the fact that I missed focus a little bit on one of those shots made a significant difference. It eliminated the sharpness differences between them, and you probably will not be as careful as I did. Now, in that first test, I used an 85mm lens, and that should have given me 6 inches of depth of field. This time around, I used a 24mm lens, and I should have had 6 feet of depth of field. But depth of field is total bullshit nowadays, especially with these high-resolution cameras, because even a millimeter will change the visible sharpness. No matter which lens you're using, no matter what your f-stop is, I was at the sweet spot for all of these lenses, the depth of field is razor thin, and missing focus by even the slightest amount will make a huge difference in the overall sharpness of the picture. And for that reason, focusing accuracy becomes extremely important with these cameras. Next question, should I use full frame or Super 35 video modes in the A7R II? For me, we'll probably use the full frame mode when we're at ISO 6400 and below, because the quality looked just great. Above that, you probably want to switch to the Super 35 mode, though of course that changes your focal length and might change your depth of field and such too, so it kind of depends on the optics. I also wanted to bring up an interesting point. You can use APS-C lenses in Super 35 mode and start to get more full frame results. For example, the Sigma 18-35 f1.8. It's a very fast lens that provides similar results to a 24-70 f2.8 lens on a full frame body. So you could stick that on with an adapter and use Super 35 mode and get great results. You also have the option of using Canon lenses with the Metabones speed booster. Now, we were using a Metabones adapter without optics. So stick on a Metabones speed booster with a Canon full frame lens and then use Super 35 mode in the Sony a7R II, and you will be back to having full frame results. And in fact, the results will be basically the same as you would get with an A7S and the Shogun. To clarify, the A7R II in Super 35 mode was a stop behind the A7S in noise, but that speed booster would be adding back that extra stop of light from a full frame lens, kind of making it an even tie if that's the way you want to go. Unfortunately, those speed boosters cost you about $650. Next question, does eye-detect autofocus work with adapted lenses? Unfortunately, the answer is no. You can use eye-detect autofocus with, for example, the 70-200 f4, the native Sony lens, but it will not work with adapted lenses. Face detection will work, but it is not adequate for short depth of field portraiture, like headshots that we would typically shoot at 200 millimeters and f4, because what we found is it almost always focuses on the tip of the person's nose, casting the eyes out of focus. So what we ended up doing for the portraiture to get reliable results was to choose a single focus point, the smallest point, and then put it on the eye, exactly like we do in the DSLR world. That was the only way to get focus on the eye. And unfortunately, it's a little more clumsy with the A7R than it is with the DSLRs, because the DSLRs have a dedicated knob for changing the focusing point. So if your subject moves, if you want to focus on the left eye instead of the right eye, it's just a couple of taps away on a DSLR. On this camera, you have to hit a shortcut button to tell it that you want to change the focusing points, and then use the kind of flimsy directional pad. It takes half an extra second. It's just not quite as fast, especially when you're shooting portraits rapidly. Someone asked if the firmware on our Metabones adapter was up to date. Yes, we double checked. It was at version 0.41, the latest version. Another question, should a wedding photographer choose the A7R II? I have to say I can't recommend this to wedding photographers. Now, I'm going to get a bunch of comments from people saying, so-and-so gets great results with this at weddings. And I'm confident that's the case. You can shoot a wedding with it, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to recommend somebody who's going to be primarily shooting weddings to choose this. I still think DSLRs own this, largely because of the low light focusing accuracy. Now, I love the Midicon 50mm f/0.95, for example, and that gets amazing effects that a wedding photographer would love. So it might take the place of using it for specialized lenses or just using it in bright light. But when you're at a wedding reception or you're in a dark church, I just wouldn't feel comfortable having all the bride's wedding photos resting on that ability to track moving subjects. Another question, why didn't we compare the video to the 5DSR and the D810? In the first review, we compared the video against other 4K cameras. The 5DSR and the D810 only shoot 1080p. The video on this is solidly better than the 5DSR and the D810. So if you're shooting video at all, this is the camera to get. I just want to make that clear. It's a 4K camera. Those record 1/4 of the resolution. We absolutely love 4K. That's one of the reasons we're so interested in this particular camera. Some Sony people felt like I didn't give the A7R II justice by not going through all the various benefits, so I'll just list them now. It has a silent shutter. The DSLRs lack that, and I love it because it allows you to shoot, for example, in a church or a funeral or street photography without really being detected. It's very subtle. I love the electronic viewfinder. In dark environments, it lights it up and lets you see in the dark, basically. It also lets you see a histogram and preview your exposure, review pictures without pulling the camera away and looking at the back of the screen. So many benefits that I absolutely love. The stabilized sensor is fantastic. That means handheld and low light, you can use fast primes, and that allows it to get much better results with lower ISOs than you would with any full-frame DSLR that's currently on the market. The tilting screen is something that the D810 and the 5DSR lack, and I love having a tilting screen. What else? The Wi-Fi, of course, is actually pretty useful, and Sony has some good apps that can help you get pictures directly onto Facebook. Unfortunately, not Twitter, but the 5DSR and the D810 completely lack Wi-Fi, so it's yet another advantage. There are lots of reasons to love this over the DSLRs. A lot of people ask me, how's the battery life? Appalling. The battery life is terrible. With the DSLRs, you can go for a weekend trip with a single fully charged battery, and you'll probably be fine. Depends how you actually shoot. But with the Sony, you will need to bring an extra battery, and you'll need to bring a charger. Now, Sony did something smart. They included a charger with this kit and 2 batteries, but you will need to bring those everywhere, and you will need to be very careful to always have one of the batteries on a charger. If you go out for a day with this, you'd better bring both batteries. There's no good way to assess exactly how many shots you'll get because it depends whether you use the electronic viewfinder or the screen on the back, how long you spend reviewing your pictures, whether you're using image stabilization, whether you remember to turn the camera off every time you finish using it, which you need to do. So I can't really tell you how long the battery is going to last, but it's not very long. And in my travels, I'll find that I often run out of batteries around lunchtime. So I might even go through more than 2 batteries in a single day. It is USB charging as well, so you can bring along one of those USB chargers and keep it going, but you're going to be thinking a lot about the batteries. And in fact, I've already missed shots because I've run out of batteries and I didn't have an extra with me. And that's really frustrating. And that is, if you're asking about the battery life, you might want to just stay in the DSLR world because those batteries just tend to last a lot longer. One exception is when you're recording video. Video pretty much kills DSLRs too, since they keep that back screen going the whole time. We found one charged battery lasted for a full hour of recording on this in 4K Super 35 mode, just as a benchmark. A lot of people asked, how is the rolling shutter for the video recording? We did not test this because Cinema 5D, one of our favorite blogs, did a great job of testing it. They found in full frame mode, the rolling shutter was quite a bit better, and it pretty much matched the GH4 results now, which are pretty good. Not great, not as good as a video camera with a global shutter, but okay. If you're in Super 35 mode, the rolling shutter is pretty bad, but head over to the Cinema 5D blog to see the full results. A lot of people also ask, why didn't you test the Sony A-mount lenses or, for example, the new Batiste 85mm lenses? Easy answer, we do not own those, and they're quite expensive. We never really invested into the Sony A-mount system. So I'm sure somebody else will go ahead and test those for you and give the results, but we just don't have the equipment to test it. If you're interested in learning more from us, check out my books. Stunning Digital Photography here has over 12 hours of video in it. Great for teaching photographic techniques, lighting, mood, expression, composition, planning, things that make far more difference in your pictures than a few megapixels will. I promise, technique matters most. Once you get into taking pictures, you'll find it's hard to organize them. You'll end up doing a lot of editing, and you want to spend your time shooting and not editing. My Lightroom book will teach you how to get the job done in Lightroom so you can get back to shooting. My photography buying guide has a ton of information about everything from cameras and bodies and lenses to flashes, studio lighting, backdrops, everything you need for photographic equipment. These are available in ebook form for $9.99 each, or you can get them in paperback form. Obviously, check out our store at northrop.photo to buy them, ships worldwide, or just go to Amazon. You can see lots of reviews there. Subscribe for more free videos, including another review of the Sony a7R II based on our real-world experiences in our upcoming trip to Peru, where I will have it on my shoulder, slinging it around, finding out how it performs in the real world. Share, tell your friends, and give this video a like. Thanks.